The bread had been cut by 9 o'clock, and it was already wrong by noon. A housewife in Chillicothe, Missouri, in the autumn of 1928, named Ruth Tompkins, had bought a loaf of bread that morning from the Chillicothe Baking Company, the first loaf of sliced bread that the bakery had ever sold, and she had taken it home and placed it on her kitchen counter, unwrapped, the way bread had always been placed. And when she came back to make sandwiches for her children's lunch, the cut surfaces had dried to a pale crust, and the slices at either end had gone stiff, in the way that bread goes stiff when the interior moisture it has been holding since the oven has found its way to the air. This was not a surprise. This was how bread behaved. Ruth Tompkins had been buying bread and baking bread for 20 years, and she understood what bread did when it was left in the air, which was that it dried, and that the rate at which it dried was the primary inconvenience of bread as a food, the single most predictable and most unavoidable feature of the thing that housewives of the era were required to manage around. What made the autumn of 1928 different from every autumn before it was that for the first time in the history of commercial bread, the loaf Ruth Tompkins had purchased had arrived already cut into uniform slices, each one of identical thickness, produced by a machine that Otto Roweather had been designing and rebuilding and refining for 17 years. The Chillicothe Baking Company had acquired the machine at the urging of its manager, Frank Bench, who believed that sliced bread would sell better than unsliced bread if the price was the same. He was correct. The bread sold out the first day. It sold out the second day. The local newspaper ran a short item noting that the bakery had offered what it called the greatest step forward in the baking industry since bread was wrapped, a phrase that the newspaper's editor had arrived at without quite understanding how exactly right it was and how exactly backwards. The bread was selling. The bread was also going stale at noon because the machinery that sliced it had not yet been paired with the machinery and the material that would make sliced bread a product rather than a novelty. The wrapper came later. It came after Roweather understood the problem he had created, which was that sliced bread presented a surface area to the air that unsliced bread did not, and that the air did to that surface exactly what it had always done to bread surfaces, which was to take the moisture out of them. A whole uncut loaf dried slowly from the outside, the crust acting as a partial barrier to the interior, the crumb retaining its softness for a day or more under reasonable conditions. A sliced loaf presented every cut face simultaneously to the air around it, and every cut face dried at the rate that exposed bread surfaces dry, which was faster than anyone who had never thought carefully about bread surfaces had previously had reason to notice. Roweather had built a machine that solved one problem and created another, and the second problem was made of wax paper and time. That second problem is the one this story is about. Not the slicer, which gets most of the credit in the history books and the newspaper retrospectives, not the uniform slice itself, which was the selling point and the novelty. The wrapper, the piece of wax paper that enclosed the loaf and held its moisture against the forces that wanted to take it away. The wrapper is the part of the story that gets told last, if it gets told at all, because wax paper is not a dramatic invention and does not have a dramatic inventor, and because the problem it solved was a problem that had always existed and that people had always managed without anyone deciding to solve it permanently. What happened in the years after 1928 was not the invention of sliced bread. It was the discovery that sliced bread without a wrapper was a problem, and that a wrapper was a solution, and that the solution was sitting in a factory in Ohio waiting to be applied to a problem that had not yet existed.
To understand why the bread wrapper mattered as much as it did, you have to understand what bread was in American life before the wrapper existed, and what the absence of a wrapper required of the people who depended on bread. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, American families obtained bread in one of two ways. They baked it themselves, which was a significant undertaking, requiring time and fuel and the specific knowledge of bread baking that had been passed across generations and that not every family possessed with equal confidence. Or they bought it from a local bakery, a small commercial operation that might supply a neighborhood or a town, and that delivered or sold bread in a form that was neither wrapped nor sliced, because neither wrapping nor slicing was considered part of the baker's job. The baker baked. The customer managed what happened afterward, which meant that the customer cut the bread herself, wrapped what remained in a cloth or a towel, or simply left it on the board under a dish, and managed the rate of its drying with the tools and the habits that her household had developed across years of buying bread. The bread that came from a local bakery in 1910 was a different object from the bread that would eventually come in a wax paper wrapper in 1930, not only in its packaging, but in its nature. Local bakeries baked daily or nearly daily because bread without a wrapper did not survive more than a day or two in acceptable condition, which meant that freshness was a function of proximity and schedule rather than of packaging. The housewife who bought bread from the neighborhood bakery was buying bread that had been baked that morning or the morning before, and she was managing its freshness by timing her purchase and her consumption to the rhythm of the bakery's production. This required coordination. It required that she be home when the bread delivery came, or that she make a trip to the bakery at the appropriate time, and it required that her family eat the bread before it went stale. The bread organized a small but persistent portion of her household's daily schedule. The bakery baked, the family ate, the bread that remained dried, and the dry bread became toast or bread pudding or was given to the dog, because nothing that bread became when it went stale was as good as the bread had been on the morning it was bought. The bread box was the household's primary defense against staling, and it was a defense that worked imperfectly and required daily management. A good bread box, made of tin or enameled metal and fitted with a door that could be closed to slow the movement of air across the loaf's surface, could extend the usable life of a fresh loaf by several hours compared to leaving it uncovered on the counter. It could not extend it by a day. The bread inside the box dried more slowly than the bread outside it, but it dried because the box was not airtight, because no box intended for kitchen use in that era was airtight, and because the bread itself was an object that contained water and that existed in an environment that wanted to take that water away. The bread box was a negotiation, not a solution. The solution, when it came, would be made of a material that the households of 1910 did not have and did not know they were waiting for. What made that solution possible was not an invention, but a manufacturing process that had been quietly maturing for 50 years before anyone applied it to bread. Wax paper existed. It had been manufactured commercially in the United States since the 1870s, used for wrapping butter, separating candy layers, lining storage boxes. It was a known material with known properties, available at commercial scale and at prices that food manufacturers could afford. The gap between the material's existence and its application to bread was not a technical gap. It was a gap in perception, a failure to see that the problem bread had always had, which was that it dried, was a problem that an existing solution could address. That failure in perception lasted for 50 years and was closed not by an engineer studying bread, but by an engineer studying slices, who created a problem urgent enough that the solution could no longer be overlooked.
Otto Rohwedder did not set out to change the American bread industry. He set out to solve a problem that he had noticed the way that people who become inventors usually notice problems, which is that he was annoyed by a specific concrete thing and thought, with the confidence of a man who had been trained as a jeweler and then retrained as an engineer, that the specific concrete thing could be fixed. The thing was the unevenness of hand-cut bread. Every housewife who cut a loaf of bread with a bread knife cut it unevenly, producing slices that were thick at one end and thin at the other. And the unevenness was not a problem of skill or attention, but of physics. The bread knife was a long, flexible thing operated by a hand subject to drift, and the loaf was a soft object that compressed under pressure, and the combination produced slices that no amount of care or practice could make consistently uniform. Rohwedder wanted uniform slices. He began designing a machine to produce them around 1912 and did not stop for 17 years. The 17 years were not simply years of incremental refinement, they were years of genuine catastrophe.
Rowetter had built a working prototype of his machine by 1917, a device that could slice a loaf of bread into uniform pieces at a commercially useful speed, and had been actively seeking a bakery willing to adopt it when a fire destroyed his factory in Monmouth, Illinois, and consumed the machine, his blueprints, and most of the capital he had invested in the project. He was 40 years old. He had spent 5 years on the machine, and he had nothing. He rebuilt from notes and memory. He rebuilt slowly because the money was harder to find the second time, because investors who had been skeptical the first time were more skeptical after the fire, and because Rowetter himself had been forced to return to the jewelry business to fund the reconstruction. The second version of the machine took 10 more years. He completed it in 1927 and began approaching bakeries in 1928, which is how Frank Bench and the Chillicothe Baking Company found it, and Ruth Tompkins found herself at her kitchen counter in the autumn of 1928 with bread that was going stale. The problem with the staling was not simply an inconvenience that housewives would learn to manage the way they had managed the inconveniences of bread before. The problem threatened to end the commercial viability of sliced bread before it had established itself, because the complaint was immediate and consistent and came from the same customers who had been enthusiastic about the product when it was fresh. The slice was the selling point. The uniform slice that could be placed in a toaster or on a plate without any preparatory work by the housewife was the thing that made sliced bread worth buying rather than simply worth noticing. But a slice that dried faster than an unsliced loaf, that presented its cut faces to the air and surrendered its moisture with an efficiency that the whole loaf had never had, was a slice that made the product worse in one measurable way for every improvement it offered in another. Rowetter understood this. He had proposed, as part of his original machine concept, that the sliced loaf be held together by skewers so that it could be presented for sale as a coherent object rather than a loose collection of pieces, and he had imagined from the beginning that some form of wrapping would be necessary. What Rowetter had not yet decided was what form that wrapping would take or how fast he needed to arrive at it. The answer to the second question came from the market. The Chillicothe Baking Company sold sliced bread, the customers complained that it went stale, and Frank Bench relayed those complaints to Rowetter with the directness of a man whose business depended on the product surviving long enough to establish itself. The pressure was commercial, and it was immediate, and it focused Rowetter's attention on the wrapper with a clarity that the theoretical problem of staling had not produced on its own. An inventor who is trying to solve a problem that might eventually matter works at one speed. An inventor who is trying to solve a problem that is currently destroying the commercial prospects of his primary invention works at another speed entirely. Rowetter began working on the wrapper in earnest in the months following the Chillicothe launch, and he did not stop until the wrapper was part of the machine.
The material that solved the bread problem existed before the bread problem existed, which is a feature of technological history that appears often enough to be almost a rule. Wax paper had been manufactured commercially in the United States since the 1870s, when the process of coating a thin sheet of paper with a layer of paraffin wax, rendering it impervious to water and grease and the passage of air, was first industrialized at a scale that made it commercially practical. The first major uses were not for bread. They were for wrapping butter, which was a product with its own moisture management problems, and for separating layers of candy in boxes, and for lining the interior of food storage containers, where a waterproof barrier was needed between the container and its contents. Wax paper was a solution in search of applications, and it found them steadily through the 1880s and 1890s and into the early years of the 20th century, at each step substituting itself for a material that had worked less well in some specific respect. The bread bakeries of the early 20th century knew about wax paper. They used it in limited ways, primarily to line the inside of delivery boxes and to separate stacked pastries. What they did not use it for, and had not needed to use it for before Rowetter's machine, was to wrap individual loaves of bread in a sealed wax paper package before it left the machine. This required developing a mechanism that could fold and seal wax paper around a soft and irregular object at the speed that commercial bread production demanded, which was not a trivial engineering problem. The loaf was not a box. It was not a cylinder. It was a shape that varied slightly from loaf to loaf because bread rose differently in different ovens and different humidities, and a wrapping machine that could accommodate that variation without tearing the paper or leaving gaps in the seal was a machine that required careful mechanical design. Roweather worked on the wrapping attachment through 1928 and into 1929, and by the time the Continental Baking Company adopted sliced bread for Wonder Bread in 1930 and took the product national, the wrapper was part of the machine, and the sealed wax paper loaf was what sliced bread looked like. The wrapping machine that Roweather developed was not a simple addition to the bread slicer. It was a second engineering problem of comparable difficulty, and in some respects more difficult, because the slicer was cutting a predictable material in a predictable direction, while the wrapper was enclosing an object that was soft on all sides, that compressed under any pressure the machine applied to it, and that arrived from the slicer in a form that was no longer structurally coherent, in the way that an unsliced loaf is coherent. A loaf of sliced bread is, in engineering terms, a collection of independent pieces held to proximity by their own weight and the slight adhesion of cut surfaces, and a wrapping machine that attempted to fold paper around it needed to apply enough pressure to crease and seal the paper without applying so much pressure that the slices shifted or damaged the product's appearance. The bakeries that watched Roweather demonstrate the combined machine in 1929 were watching a device that solved two problems simultaneously, and the ones that adopted it understood what the ones that did not would understand more slowly over the following 5 years, that the wrapper and the slicer were not separable products, they were a single system, and the system was the future of commercial bread.
The Continental Baking Company had been watching the Chillicothe experiment with the careful attention of a large company observing a small one do something that might or might not be worth doing at scale. Continental operated bakeries across the country under various brand names and had the distribution infrastructure and the production capacity to take a product national in a way that a regional bakery in Missouri could not. What it did not have in 1928 and 1929 was certainty that sliced bread was a product rather than a gimmick. The evidence from Chillicothe was encouraging but limited. A regional bakery in a small city had sold a novelty to local customers who were enthusiastic because the product was new, and novelty was not easy to distinguish from genuine demand. Continental's management understood that what sold in Chillicothe in 1928 would not necessarily sell in Chicago or New York in 1930, and they spent 2 years evaluating the question before committing to the wrapper and the slicer and the national distribution that would turn sliced bread from a regional curiosity into an American institution. The decision to use Wonder Bread as the vehicle for the national launch was not arbitrary. Wonder Bread had existed since 1921, when Continental introduced it as a premium white bread in balloon-decorated packaging, the balloons referencing the international balloon race that one of the company's executives had witnessed in Indianapolis and that had struck him as a sufficient emblem of wonder to name a bread after. The brand had 9 years of consumer recognition behind it when Continental decided to make it the face of sliced bread, which meant that the novelty of slicing was being introduced on a platform that was already familiar. This was a deliberate choice. A new product attached to a known name was easier for a grocery customer to pick up and try than a new product attached to a name she had never seen. The wrapper and the slice were the new things. Wonder Bread was the thing she already trusted, and the trust made the new things easier to accept. The wrapper that appeared on the national Wonder Bread launch in 1930 was not identical to what Rowedetter that first proposed. The Continental Baking Company's engineers and the machinery manufacturers they worked with had spent 2 years improving the mechanical design of the wrapping stage and refining the wax paper formulation to better maintain the seal through the handling that bread experienced between the bakery and the customer's kitchen. The paper was heavier than the early versions. The seal at the ends of the loaf was more secure. The printing on the exterior, which had been minimal in the Chillicothe loaves, was elaborate on the Wonder Bread loaves, because Continental understood that the wrapper was not only a functional barrier to air, but a surface that communicated information about the product to the customer who picked it up in the grocery store. The red, yellow, and blue balloons that decorated the Wonder Bread wrapper were not accidental. They were a deliberate signal that this was a specific brand of a specific product, and the wrapper was as much a part of that signal as the balloons. What happened next happened quickly by the standards of a food industry that had not changed its primary product in 2 generations. Within 3 years of the national launch, wrapped sliced bread had gone from a novelty available at one bakery in one city in Missouri to the standard form in which bread was sold across the country. Competitors followed Continental into the wrapped sliced market not because they had been convinced by Roederer's arguments or by the engineering logic of the wrapper, but because their customers were asking for sliced bread and buying it when it was available, and a grocer whose shelves had both wrapped sliced and unwrapped unsliced was watching the wrapped sliced leave faster every week. The market communicated the answer with a clarity that 2 years of Continental's internal deliberations had not produced. When the answer is that clear, the industry that ignores it does so with a cost it eventually pays in customers.
The practical consequence of the sealed wax paper wrapper was not dramatic in the way that mechanical innovations are sometimes dramatic. There was no moment when a family sat down to dinner and experienced something that had never existed before. The bread was simply still soft the next morning. It was soft on the second morning. It was soft with some qualification on the third morning, and at that point the softness it retained was qualitatively different from the softness of the first morning, but was still recognizably the softness of bread rather than the dryness of bread that had been left on the counter, which was the only comparison available. The wrapper did not make bread immortal. It made bread durable in a way that bread had never been durable before, and the durability it provided reorganized the domestic logistics of bread in ways that were quiet and cumulative and took years to become visible as a change in American household life. The housewife who had organized her morning around the bread delivery or the bakery purchase because bread that was not fresh was bread that was unusable now had a different set of constraints. Bread that lasted 3 days rather than 1 did not need to be bought daily. It could be bought twice a week, which meant that the bread purchase was no longer a daily obligation, but a periodic one, and the scheduling that had organized itself around bread's rate of deterioration could be organized around something else instead. This was not a trivial change. The daily or near-daily bread purchase had been part of the rhythm of domestic management for generations, and its elimination from that rhythm created time that had not previously been available. Time measured not in hours, but in the small increments that add up across a week to something meaningful for a woman whose mornings were organized around the requirements of a household. The wrapper returned 15 minutes. 3 or 4 days a week to a woman who had previously spent those minutes acquiring fresh bread before the old bread became useless. The second consequence was less about time and more about distance. Bread that lasted 3 days could travel. A local bakery whose bread lasted 1 day could serve a neighborhood. A bakery whose bread lasted 3 days, properly wrapped, could serve a city. And a bakery whose distribution system was organized around trucks and regional warehouses could serve a region. The wrapper transformed bread from a local product into a product that could be industrialized, because industrialization requires the time between production and consumption to be long enough to accommodate the distances and the handling that industrial distribution involves. A loaf of bread baked in a central facility, wrapped in wax paper, loaded onto a truck, driven to a warehouse, transferred to a delivery vehicle, and placed on a grocery store shelf, needed to arrive at that shelf still soft. And the only thing that made it possible for it to arrive still soft was the barrier between the bread's moisture and the air around it that the wrapper provided. Without the wrapper, there was no Wonder Bread. Without Wonder Bread, there was no national bread industry. The third consequence was the one that the housewives who benefited from it were least likely to name directly, because it operated below the level of conscious decision. Bread that was uniform in its slices and reliable in its freshness was bread that could be planned around rather than accommodated. The lunch that required 2 slices of the same thickness every morning could be planned the night before, because the wrapper guaranteed that the bread would still be soft and that the slices would be the same thickness as the slices from the day before. This sounds like a small thing. It was a small thing, but the domestic economy of an American household in the 1930s was composed almost entirely of small things, each of which consumed a portion of a woman's planning attention and morning time, and the bread that required no special accommodation was bread that returned that attention and that time to other uses. The wrapper did not change how families thought about bread. It changed how much they had to think about it at all.
The small local bakery that had served American neighborhoods for generations did not disappear immediately after Wonder Bread went national. It declined over a period of years that are difficult to assign a precise chronology to, because the decline was not uniform across regions or cities, and because the small bakery did not lose its customers all at once, but gradually, as the customers came to prefer the convenience of the wrapped sliced loaf available in the grocery store over the unwrapped, unsliced loaf available at the bakery that required a separate trip. The local baker could not wrap. Not at first, and not easily. The wrapping machine that Roweather had developed was an industrial device, sized and priced for the volumes that a commercial bakery produced, and the small neighborhood operation that baked 30 or 50 loaves a day could not justify the capital cost of a machine designed to process hundreds of loaves an hour. The wrapper was, among other things, a barrier to entry that the larger operations had crossed, and the smaller ones could not. The bakers who survived the transition to wrapped sliced bread were the ones who were large enough to afford the machinery or who found products that the wrapped loaf could not replace. The specialty baker, the one who made rye bread with a particular regional character, or the one whose cinnamon rolls had been bought by the same families for 20 years, retained a customer base that the generic white bread of the national brands could not take from it. But the generic white bread market, which was the largest portion of the bread market, was captured with a speed and completeness that the local bakers who had supplied it did not see coming until it had already happened. The wrapper was not the only factor in this consolidation. The Depression was also a factor, because the larger operations could price bread lower than the small ones during the years when price was the primary consideration. But the wrapper was the enabling technology. Without it, the national brand was logistically impossible regardless of price. The bakery unions, which had organized the skilled workers who had been essential to small bakery operations, found themselves representing a workforce that was being reduced by mechanization at the same time that the industry was being consolidated by the economics that mechanization enabled. The bread slicer replaced the person who cut the bread. The wrapping machine replaced the person who wrapped it. The centralized production facility replaced the neighborhood bakery that had employed 4 or 5 workers with a facility that employed 20 but produced 100 times as much bread. The per-loaf labor content of bread declined sharply through the 1930s, and the decline was directly attributable to the mechanical systems that Roweather's invention had set in motion. The bread was cheaper, the bread was better preserved, the bread was available in every grocery store rather than at the neighborhood bakery during its opening hours. The people who had made that bread and wrapped it by hand were available for other work. What the unions could not argue against was a product that the public preferred. The wrapped sliced loaf was not imposed on the American consumer by the bread industry's consolidation. It was chosen by the American consumer in numbers large enough and consistent enough that the bread industry's consolidation followed from the choice rather than preceding it. The worker whose job was displaced by the wrapping machine was displaced by a machine that was doing something the customer had decided she wanted done. That is a difficult argument to make at a union meeting because the logic is impeccable and the consequence is still a lost job, and impeccable logic does not pay a man's rent. The bakers who had wrapped bread by hand for 20 years knew how to do it and had done it well, and the machine that replaced them did not do it better in any qualitative sense. It did it faster and cheaper and without wages,
And those three things together were the argument that no union could answer.
On January 18, 1943, the United States government banned sliced bread. The announcement came from Claude Wickard, the Secretary of Agriculture, who issued an order through the Food Distribution Administration restricting the sale of sliced bread at bakeries across the country, effective immediately. The reason given was wax paper. The reasoning behind the reason was that wax paper was a material of limited wartime supply, that its production required raw materials that were also needed for military applications, and that the use of wax paper to wrap individual loaves of sliced bread was a civilian application of a strategic material that the War Production Board had decided could be reduced without causing unacceptable hardship. The hardship the board expected was inconvenient. The hardship that arrived was something else. The response from the American public to the sliced bread ban was unlike the response to any other wartime rationing measure. Americans had accepted, with varying degrees of grace, the rationing of meat and butter and sugar and gasoline and nylons and dozens of other products that the war had made scarce. They had accepted the blackout requirements and the Victory Garden campaigns and the paper drives and the scrap metal collections. They had reorganized their domestic lives around the requirements of a country at war, with a degree of cooperation that the government's planners had not entirely expected. The bread was different. The response to the sliced bread ban was immediate, voluminous, and in its character unlike anything the Food Distribution Administration had handled. Women wrote letters to newspapers. They wrote letters to their congressmen. They wrote letters to Claude Wickard personally, letters that were not the polite letters of citizens accepting a wartime sacrifice, but the pointed letters of consumers who had been given something and had it taken away and wanted it back, and were not prepared to accept that the taking was justified. One letter that reached the New York Times from a housewife identified as Mary Horton of New York City explained the situation with a directness that the paper found worth printing. She noted that she could cut bread with a bread knife and had cut bread with a bread knife before sliced bread existed, but that she had also done so with 2 fewer children at home and without a job at the factory that required her to leave the house before 7 in the morning, and that the time she had previously spent cutting bread was time that was no longer available to her, and that the government's assessment of what a wartime sacrifice consisted of appeared to have been made by people who had not recently cut a loaf of bread in a household that had other demands on its time. The letter was 2 paragraphs long. It received more mail from readers in response than any letter the Times had published that month. What the letters revealed, collectively, was something that the government had not measured when it issued the order, which was the degree to which sliced wrapped bread had reorganized itself into the structure of the American morning in the 13 years since Wonder Bread had gone national. The ban did not return people to 1930. It imposed the requirements of 1930 on a daily life that had reorganized itself around what the wrapper made possible, a daily life that now included jobs outside the home for women who had previously managed households full-time, children who expected uniform toast at a certain time each morning, and schedules that had no slack in them for the extra minutes that an unwrapped, unsliced loaf required. The government had measured the wax paper. It had not measured the morning. The letters explained the morning in detail to people who had made a policy decision without it.
The sliced bread ban lasted 47 days. On March 8, 1943, the Food Distribution Administration rescinded the order, citing what the administration's official statement described as the small savings in wax paper that the ban had achieved relative to the disruption it had produced. The disruption, to be precise, was the letter-writing campaign and the sustained public complaint that had made the ban politically untenable rather than technically indefensible. The wax paper savings were real, though smaller than the original projections had assumed, because housewives who could not buy sliced bread at the bakery had begun purchasing wax paper in greater quantities to wrap their home-cut bread,
which had the effect of shifting the wax paper consumption from the bakery to the household without reducing the total amount of wax paper being used for bread-related purposes. The government had underestimated both the public's attachment to sliced bread and the ingenuity with which the public would substitute behaviors when the product it preferred was removed. The 47 days of the sliced bread ban produced the clearest measure available of what the wrapper had actually done to American domestic life in the 13 years since Wonder Bread had gone national. The measure was not an economic calculation or a time study or a survey of housewife preferences. It was the character and volume of the complaint. American women had accepted gasoline rationing. They had accepted meat rationing and sugar rationing and nylon rationing. They had not accepted the loss of sliced bread. And the reason they had not accepted it was that sliced bread, unlike gasoline or meat or nylon, was woven into the daily structure of their mornings in a way that the other rationed products were not. The school lunches that depended on uniform slices, the toast that required consistent thickness to fit the slots of the electric toasters that had become standard kitchen appliances in the same years that sliced bread had become standard. The time that had never been spare and was now being spent with a bread knife on a loaf that refused to cut straight. The ban's failure also revealed something about the wrapper that its advocates had understood but had not been required to argue for. The wrapper was not a luxury. In the economic taxonomy that wartime rationing operated within, a luxury was something that enhanced the quality of life without constituting a material necessity, and luxuries were the appropriate candidates for wartime sacrifice. The sliced bread wrapper looked like a luxury. It was a convenience, a labor-saving device, a piece of packaging that had existed for only 13 years and whose absence restored the country to a condition it had been in as recently as 1930. But the 47 days demonstrated that the wrapper had become, in those 13 years, a structural element of the domestic economy in a way that its recent invention made it easy to underestimate. The housewife of 1943 was not the housewife of 1930. She had a factory job or a war job or a household whose management had reorganized itself around the efficiencies the wrapper made possible. And those efficiencies were not optional. They were the way her morning worked. What the 47 days established, permanently and beyond argument, was that the bread wrapper had crossed the line from convenience to necessity in the course of 13 years, and that the crossing had happened quietly enough that nobody in the government had noticed until the wrapper was removed and the necessity became visible in its absence. This is how most necessities establish themselves. They do not arrive with announcements. They arrive as improvements, as things that make an existing process slightly easier, and they are adopted because they make the process easier. And over time, the process reorganizes itself around the improvement until the improvement is no longer an addition to the process, but a component of it. Remove the component, and the process does not revert to its prior form. It breaks because the prior form no longer exists. The wrapper was a component. The 47 days of 1943 were the proof.
The chemistry of bread staling was not fully understood when Rowetter designed his wrapper, and the understanding that developed in the years afterward illuminated in precise terms what the wrapper had been doing by empirical necessity. Bread is primarily starch, and starch is a polymer made of glucose molecules arranged in chains that themselves are arranged during baking in a partially crystalline structure that is responsible for the bread's initial softness. When bread cools after baking, a process called retrogradation begins, in which the starch molecules start rearranging themselves from the disordered structure of the hot crumb toward the more ordered crystalline structure that starch assumes when it is cool and undisturbed. This rearrangement is what produces staling. It is not primarily a loss of moisture from the bread to the air, though moisture loss contributes to the perception of staleness, particularly at the cut surfaces.
The fundamental process is a molecular reorganization driven by temperature and time rather than by humidity, and it produces a crumb texture that is perceptibly different from the fresh crumb, even when the moisture content of the bread has not changed significantly. This distinction matters because it explains both what the wrapper could do and what it could not do. The wrapper could prevent the surface drying that made cut bread unpleasant to the touch and accelerated the perception of staleness by presenting a desiccated exterior. The wrapper could not prevent retrogradation because retrogradation was a molecular process that proceeded regardless of the humidity of the air surrounding the loaf. A bread sealed perfectly against moisture loss still staled because the staling was not primarily a moisture phenomenon. What the wrapper prevented was the acceleration of perceived staleness by surface desiccation, which was the aspect of staleness most immediately apparent to the person who opened the bag and pressed a slice between her fingers. The interior of a properly wrapped loaf remained soft to the touch for 2 to 3 days, not because retrogradation was prevented, but because the surface did not dry, and the dry surface was the first signal most people received that bread had gone stale. The wrapper managed the signal. It could not manage the underlying process. The practical implication of this distinction, which became clear to the food scientists who studied it through the 1940s and 1950s, was that the optimal storage condition for bread was not room temperature in a wax paper wrapper, but refrigeration, which slowed retrogradation by reducing the molecular mobility that drove it, combined with a moisture barrier that prevented surface drying. Refrigeration in practice turned out to be a complicated recommendation. Refrigerated bread sliced well and stayed soft at the surface, but the temperature that slowed retrogradation in the interior also affected the crust in ways that most people found unpleasant, and the interaction between the cold and the wrapper produced condensation under certain conditions that created its own texture problems. The food scientists who arrived at these conclusions published them in trade journals that the bread industry read carefully and applied selectively, and the result was that the practical advice about bread storage that reached American housewives through the 1950s and 1960s was a simplified version of a complicated truth. The simplified truth was this: keep the bread in its wrapper, keep it at room temperature, and use it within 2 or 3 days. This was what the science said when stripped of its qualifications, and it was what the wrapper had been designed to support. And it was what American households did from the mid-1930s onward, without knowing anything about retrogradation or starch crystallinity, or the difference between the rate of moisture loss from a cut surface and the rate of molecular rearrangement in the interior of a crumb. They knew what they could feel with their fingers when they opened the bag each morning. They knew whether the bread was soft or whether it was not, and for the first time in the history of bread in American homes, the bread was soft for 3 mornings in a row, which was 3 mornings more than it had ever been soft before. The science explained why. The wrapper was why. The science came later.
The bread wrapper on every loaf of bread sold in an American grocery store today is the direct descendant of the wrapper that Rowetter designed for the bread slicing machine he completed in 1927 and that Continental Baking adopted for Wonder Bread in 1930. The material has changed. The wax paper of the early wrappers has been replaced by polyethylene and polypropylene films that provide a more effective moisture barrier with less weight and less material, and that can be sealed by heat rather than by the mechanical folding and crimping that the wax paper seal required. The printing on the exterior has become more elaborate and more precisely controlled. The tie at the end of the bag, the small plastic clip or twist tie that closes the loaf after the original seal has been opened, is a detail that did not exist in 1930 because the original wrapper was not designed to be opened and resealed, but simply opened and used. That clip is itself an invention, one of the small inventions that the commercial bread package has accumulated over 90 years of incremental refinement. What has not changed is the principle. The principle is that bread is an object that contains moisture and that the air around it wants to take that moisture away, and that the way to keep bread soft is to keep the air away from the bread, and that the way to keep the air away from the bread is to enclose the bread in a material that the air cannot pass through. This was the principle in 1930, and it is the principle now, and the wrapper on the bread you buy is doing the same thing that Rohwedder's wrapper did, by the same mechanism, to the same end. The chemistry has been better understood since then, the materials have been improved, the machinery that applies the wrapper to the loaf operates at speeds and with tolerances that would have been incomprehensible to the engineers at the Chillicothe Baking Company in 1928. The principle has not been improved because it did not need to be improved. It needed to be discovered and then applied and then maintained and then forgotten in the way that all principles are eventually forgotten when the problem they solve has been solved long enough that the problem itself is forgotten. Ruth Tompkins, the housewife in Chillicothe who bought the first loaf of sliced bread in the autumn of 1928 and found it dry by noon, bought a wrapped loaf the following year when Rohwedder's wrapping attachment had been refined enough to produce a seal that held through the handling between the bakery and the kitchen counter. She did not note the difference in any document that has survived. She was not a person who documented things. She was a person who made sandwiches for her children and cut bread on a wooden board and managed a household in a small city in Missouri at a time when the technology of daily life was being remade in ways that were not announced as they arrived, but were simply there one day when they had not been there before. The bread stayed soft. She stopped thinking about it. She died in 1971 without knowing that the wrapper on the bread in her granddaughter's kitchen was made of a different material than the wrapper that had first appeared on her counter in 1929, or that the chemistry behind its function had been studied in university laboratories and published in journals she would never have occasion to read. She knew only what the wrapper showed her every morning when she opened it, which was that the bread was still soft and that there was enough of it to last until Thursday, and that she did not need to make a trip to the bakery today. This was the promise the wrapper made. It was a small promise calibrated to the scale of a morning and a kitchen and a family that needed to be fed before school. It was a promise that required 17 years of engineering and a fire and a rebuild and a national distribution system and 47 days of government error to arrive at. It is kept every morning in every kitchen where a bag of bread is opened. The bread is soft. It is waiting to be used.